I will now turn the webinar over to our presenter. Dr. Paula Dominici is the Director of Training Programs with the Center of Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. She is also the co-author of the recently published book, Courage After Fire for Parents and Service Members, Strategies for Coping When Your Son or Daughter Returns from Deployment. Thank you for joining us, and now we will begin our webinar.
Thank you so much, Marcy. I'd like to talk to all of you today about parents of service members, who are a group of military-connected individuals who often go unrecognized and unappreciated by our communities. In this presentation, you'll see that I've woven in several quotes from parents to give voice to the topic, and also because there's so little research on this population to draw from. The quotes are from 2 different surveys that my colleagues and I gave to different parents of service members. To kick this discussion off, I want to read the following quote from a mother of a service member. She says, "Parents suffer from the stress of having kids in the military, and this does need to be acknowledged. As a psychologist who's worked with service members and their families for a long time, what I've come to discover is that parents of service members really are an underserved group who need our support and our recognition." In one of those surveys that I just mentioned that we distributed to parents, we asked the question that you see on this slide: how important is it that your physician knows you are a parent of a service member? The next few slides give their responses. One parent said, "I think it's very important that your MD knows you have a deployed child. It can be identified as a stressor in your life." Another mother said, "It's very important. As parents, we are always concerned over our sons and daughters' issues in the military, especially during wartime. Yes, it helps the doctor to determine the stress factors." And this is one final quote on the topic where this mother said the same thing, basically. "Yes, it's very important that physicians know a parent's child is deployed. Different stresses come along with deployments. Blood pressure and temperature may escalate. Frequent headaches, lack of sleep, or loss of appetite. Many different symptoms arise during this time, and it would be a great thing if they knew this before parents are misdiagnosed. If there are grandchildren involved, this is an added stress. If children are school age, they have to be driven there and picked up. Homework needs to be done. Teens are another story." As you can see from these quotes from the parents, they all are emphasizing just how important it is that physicians like you know their circumstances. Before we move along too far in this presentation, I want to define who parents of service members are. Sometimes there's confusion in the popular press and other sources who might not get it right. So parents of service members who we're going to be discussing today are all those mothers and fathers, biological, step, adoptive, and foster parents of active duty, guard, and reserve service members and veterans. A military parent, on the other hand, is a military member who has children. Understanding these differences is really important because, unfortunately, parents of service members aren't considered dependents in the Department of Defense except in very rare circumstances. Otherwise, the standard dependents under DOD is the spouse and the children. And what this means, then, is that the mothers and fathers of service members aren't eligible for benefits, services, or resources through the Department of Defense. They're not going to be included in any of the outreach that the spouse and children would receive. So when we see figures about military families in the news or in research, more often than not, the numbers are not including parents of service members when they are talking about family members, as you see here in the red. And yet, if you look at the blue portion of this graphic, you'll see that military personnel, their numbers are about 2.2 million. This means that all the parents of those individuals of that 2.2 million aren't getting services or help directly from the Department of Defense. In a similar way, if you look at this slide and look at the statistics, which are of Specifically, it's looking at post-9/11 veterans. We see that there's approximately 2.2 million of these veterans. And again, their parents aren't going to receive any sort of benefit or service from the VA system. So how many parents of service members are there? Well, it's difficult to calculate because the DoD and the VA don't track these numbers. We can approximate, and as you see on this slide, we could probably say there's about 4.5 million. We can probably say there are about 4.5 million parents of all active duty Guard and Reserve service members. So what I was saying is it's very difficult to calculate the exact number of parents of service members because these numbers aren't tracked. And if you add to them grandparents, parents-in-laws, and other parent figures, it's unfortunate because they constitute a large number. As the bottom line, there are millions of parents of service members, and for many of these military members, the children are young. That is, about 50% of our active duty troops are 25 years of age or younger. And a good number of them are single. About 46% of active duty Guard and Reservists are not married. What this means is that these individuals are returning home and sometimes living with their parents or living nearby or relying on their parents for assistance. And even if they're older and married, they often still play a critical role in their service member's life. And yet, there's very little research on this topic, as I mentioned earlier, and there's very few resources and services just tailored for the parents of service members. This comment by a parent of a service member underscores the lack of resources that this population tends to face. What you hear here is, to be honest, parents like us who are involved in our military kids' life don't get much help from the military or VA unless our daughter's children and husband are part of the picture. The irony is that these parents of service members really do serve our country in a big way by offering their military sons and daughters all kinds of support and care throughout the deployment cycle. As you hear in this quote, they feel like they are serving. What it says is, be sensitive to parents of the military and never just write them off as a non-important issue. The parent is serving our country along with their soldier and has a connection and bonding that civilians don't understand. Let's talk further about what parents of service members contribute and what they may experience in their roles as mothers and fathers of service members. We know that parents of service members provide a great deal of support and assistance to their son or daughter during all the phases of deployment or when their service member leaves the military. As you can see from this slide, there's a list of things that they often do. They often make sure their child has everything ready before they deploy. Parents often are the ones that are going to take care of their service members' household items or finances, maybe their children. They offer support to the service member's spouse. They often are the hub of communication for the service member, keeping other family members informed. They help with reintegration challenges, and often they become a primary caregiver if the service member becomes physically or emotionally injured. And this is not an exhaustive list. Before, during, and after deployments, these mothers and fathers face many unique challenges, as you see here. They're often stuck not knowing when and where their son or daughter is going to deploy. They're confronted with surprises. For example, their son or daughter enlists and they didn't know, or they re-up and they're shocked to find that out. They're faced with letting go and saying goodbye, then reuniting with their service member multiple times, which is obviously very stressful. They face the risk of injury or death to their service member, and on top of all of these challenges, they have the rest of their life to manage. These hardships and challenges, which go beyond the norm faced by most parents, can be incredibly stressful and overwhelming, as this quote depicts. Besides watching him leave on a dingy gray bus to go to war, the hardest thing I've ever had to do is sign a power of attorney document for my 18-year-old son. In this next comment, a mother shares her emotional stress when her child deploys. I knew what I was doing when I married a soldier, but sending my little girl off to war was a whole new ball game. And in this next quote, we again hear the stress involved with being a parent of a service member. My elder son is sensitive to the attention his brother receives. I've had to make sure that I don't neglect my non-military son in his life while I worry and am quite preoccupied with my younger son's situation. And finally, this quote speaks to the stress of having a daughter deployed. I'm very proud of what my daughter has accomplished. For me, I find that too much of my time is spent worrying about my daughter, and I need to spend my energies on other matters, like enjoying my life and not living for an answer to the most recent email. Overall, however, parents of service members are remarkably resilient and take great pride in their military child and his or her service to our nation. However, what I found in my work with parents of service members is that they can experience a range of reactions in response to the many stressors that they encounter that we've been talking about. As you see on this slide, parents may react by becoming depressed or detached. They may feel incredibly anxious or worried or lonely. They also can respond positively. For example, they can feel a great deal of pride and be highly motivated to help their service member. These types of reactions can be short-lived, they can linger for longer periods and become debilitating. They can be intermittent or mild, or they can become intense. Obviously, each parent will have his or her own unique set of reactions. In addition, relationships can become strained. We hear from this father in the following quote how his child's deployment was negatively impacting his relationship with his wife. What he says is, "We were both so stressed out that we rarely felt like being intimate. My wife was going through the same trauma, so I just tried not to make it worse for her, and I tried unsuccessfully to hide my own worries." And we get a glimpse of the deep emotional and physical toll this mother feels in the following quote. "When he was deployed, I felt emotionally depleted. Nothing was going on in my brain. I was not moving off the sofa. I couldn't say his name. I woke up screaming because I swear I heard him call out to me, 'Mom, Mom, are you there?'" Physical health issues also can surface in response to the ongoing challenges that these parents confront. For example, if you look at this slide, parents of service members may find themselves having more headaches or troubled sleep. They may feel run down and tired. They may have more aches and pains. As a way to cope, they may turn to drinking or smoking more. They may overeat or undereat as a way to deal with their stress, or they may become fixated on the news and the email. On a positive note, they may become more active in their military community, or they may respond by forming their own group or getting into exercise. If the negative, unhealthy responses persist and begin interfering with their daily life, they can lead to more serious behavioral health conditions, which we'll discuss shortly. Let's talk about how you can identify those patients of yours who are parents of service members. What I've discovered through my work with parents of service members is that they tend to adopt many of the positive values and attitudes that their military children embrace, even though they themselves often are not in the military or haven't served. For example, they tend to be selfless. They put their military child first and the military mission first. They're often extremely loyal to their goals and the demands and lifestyle of the military. They're the type of people who are going to tough it out. They're not going to complain. They're going to do whatever it takes to help their child. They don't seek recognition. They're not wanting attention. And some have served in the military themselves. So as physicians, you'll need to ask and find out if your patient is a parent of a service member directly. They may not volunteer this information. We recommend that you just be direct and consider asking them both verbally and on intake paperwork. In this comment, a mother underscores the idea of making this a routine question when she says, "Because we've been at war for 12 years, the likelihood that a physician will encounter a military spouse, parent, or former soldier is very high. I believe that on any new intake form or encounter with a patient, A standard question along with height, age, and weight should be something like, were you a member of the military, or are you the parent or spouse of someone in the military? If so, would you like to discuss any issues that you are concerned with? Here are other examples of what you could also ask on an intake paperwork that are very simple. Things like, are you connected to the military in any way? Have you or has anybody in your family served in the military? If yes, would you like to discuss any concerns about this with your physician? Once you've identified that your patient is a parent of a service member, whether it's on an intake form or verbally, you can follow up with more questions like these that you see on the screen. Questions that are going to invite them to share a little bit more about their experience and circumstances. Something like, can you share with me how you're coping? Or how do you take care of yourself? Once you've learned that your patient is a parent of a service member, it's important to consider the cultural context he or she comes from. The metaphor of an iceberg shown here has been used to describe various race and ethnic cultures, and it can fit for the military culture. Some of what identifies parents of service members may be apparent or above the waterline, as you see here. But a lot of what identifies parents of service members is not really apparent. It's below the surface. It's in that part that's called the hidden culture. And this is the more enduring characteristics of the military culture, beliefs and values and guiding ideals that are often part of that warrior ethos. These are values like enduring with dignity, honor, sacrificing, having a fighting spirit, working as a team, and being loyal. As you would expect, these types of military values may be important to some parents of service members when they get medical care from you. As you see on this slide, these parents may place a higher premium on things like timeliness and structure. They may come in with more of a make-it-happen attitude. They may be more receptive to direct and specific goals, and they may use acronyms, which you're going to need to ask about and get so you can understand their experience better. So let's talk about what you can do realistically when you have a patient who is a parent of a service member, recognizing that you have limited time. Here are 4 ideas that I would offer that you consider for facilitating care with parents of service members. You can see them on the slide here, and we're going to go through all 4 of them. I do want to just stress, as you see in the bottom line in blue, that it's important to remember that you may be the main gateway to helping a parent of a service member get the physical or mental health they need. How this parent perceives you and your interaction can affect whether they come back or go on to seek care. One of the first things you can do with a parent who is a patient of yours is to discuss common reactions to stress. You can normalize and validate these reactions and discuss how there's a variety of ways that stress manifests itself. The next 3 slides are a list of responses that the parents I surveyed gave, reflecting the reactions they have had. I won't read all of them, but you can see they're saying that they've experienced depression or crying spells or sleep problems. Some of them indicated weight gain from stress eating. Others said they were extremely anxious, worried a lot, and another said exacerbation of a pre-existing clinical depression occurred when her son was deployed. Other comments include physical symptoms that occurred, bouts of diarrhea, frequent headaches, lack of sleep, and loss of appetite. You can expect to hear a variety of responses to the stressors these parents encounter. Individuals respond and cope differently. This is illustrated here by the crystal refracting light, which is then dispersed in a variety of colors. In a similar way, the reactions to stress are diverse, yet to be expected. It can also be helpful to briefly discuss the stress cycle, to point out how there's 4 components, as you see here on the slide. I won't go through all of them, but basically that these 4 components, whether they're physiological, whether they're related to the mind and cognitions, whether they're emotional or related to behaviors, they all interact with each other and can make the symptoms worse, so the overall stress becomes elevated and can spin out of control. After discussing common reactions, it's important to ask how intense and frequently the individual is experiencing these symptoms and complaints. It's important to ask whether they're impacting the quality of their life and their work or their relationships. This can help you determine if the reactions have moved more into that red zone of a diagnosable clinical behavioral health condition like major depression or insomnia, and whether a referral or treatment may be warranted. A second thing you can do when providing medical care to parents of service members is give them basic ideas for relieving their stress. Many of the parents I surveyed indicated that this is what they want to hear from their physician, ways to help them cope with their stress. This list shows responses from the parents I surveyed about how they were relieving their stress. Things like relying on their faith, doing yoga, having a good support system, and in some cases, taking medication. While some parents obviously find healthy ways to cope, this quote highlights a mother's struggle. What she said is, "I had none. There were no other parents around that I was aware of in my area. I cried a lot and had nightmares. I spoke to my boyfriend, but he didn't understand." When discussing general stress management strategies, it's important to talk about self-care. What I found is that parents of service members often don't believe they should take the time to take care of themselves or their needs. They feel guilty. They feel like 24/7 they should be focusing on the needs of their military child. It's important to let them know that to give themselves permission to take care of themselves, which in the long run will make them better able to support their military child. One way they can take care of themselves is to monitor their physical and mental health on a regular basis. And this need not be anything complicated. They can do it simply and quickly by having a scale of 0 to 10 and asking themselves where they fall on that day. There also are apps, like you see here on the screen, the T2 Mood Tracker, which would allow them to track their emotional health, and results are then displayed on a graph. In addition, we've discussed earlier how helpful it is to ask them about how they're coping. It's good to ask them, it's good to have a conversation about whether they're using healthy or unhealthy strategies. As you can see on this slide, in some cases, unhealthy habits may have developed, or habits that were previously done in moderation may now be practiced more frequently and with greater intensity and have become harmful. For example, maybe the parent is now smoking or drinking more to try to curb their anxiety, or maybe they're eating less because they're physically too stressed out. Or are they tracking the news about where their military child is and glued to the internet such that it's really become an obsession? Are they overworking or over-exercising as ways to distract themselves? Having this discussion without judgment can get the parent thinking about how to increase their healthy coping strategies and how to reduce or stop unhealthy or even harmful habits. You can also direct parents of service members to use mind-body techniques when you're talking about general ways to relieve stress, and this doesn't have to be a long conversation. As you see on the slide here, there are many types of relaxation training skills that they can learn. Lots of books, lots of websites have information about these techniques, and there also are apps, as you see on the right side there. As part of this discussion on stress relief strategies, it's also important to encourage the parent to give themselves downtime, to participate in enjoyable activities. This goes back to the self-care we were referring to. They need to be able to give themselves permission to have fun and to enjoy themselves in certain hobbies that maybe they used to do. Additionally, parents often need to be reminded to do the basics, things like just eating well and staying fit and getting good regular sleep. You can also educate these parents about the power of self-talk. Let them know that what they say to themselves actually can impact their emotions and their behaviors, that thoughts indeed influence emotions, and how they act. And there are many resources that could help them learn to modify their cognition so they're more helpful. If I had to choose one strategy to recommend to a parent, it would be encouraging them to express their feelings and experiences and to create a support circle. Out of all the things that I've heard from parents of service members, it's getting support from other mothers and fathers who they can relate to, which they have found most helpful. There are a variety of ways that they can do this, which you see on this slide. They can talk to someone individually who they trust, a good friend, a family member, a counselor, maybe clergy. They can join a parents group, and if there isn't a parents group, they can develop or start a new one in their area. They can journal, and the journaling doesn't have to be done formally. It could even be done on the computer. Or they might gain this sense of a support network through a church or some place of worship. Another stress relief strategy you can review with parents is setting personal goals, long-term and short-term. For example, during their child's deployment, maybe they can have the goal of taking a class or starting a project or a hobby they've always wanted to do. This goes back to giving themselves permission to focus on themselves. You can also help draw their attention to any positives that they've gained from their experience as a parent of a service member. Maybe they developed closer relationships with their grandchildren or a daughter-in-law. Maybe they feel a much greater sense of purpose now that they've volunteered to help the military. So again, those are just suggestions for strategies that you could give to your patients or parents of service members about how to manage their stress. In some encounters with these parents, however, you may want to use a brief screen if you're concerned that he or she may indeed have a behavioral health condition that warrants some form of treatment, whether it's going to be therapy or medication. So in this section, I'm just going to briefly review some behavioral health screens that you could consider having at the ready. It's important to note that for any of these screens, which I'll go over, when a parent pops positive or there's a positive score, we want to remember that doesn't mean it equals a diagnosis. What it does is suggest that further evaluation is warranted. On this slide here, what I'm showing you is the Insomnia Severity Index. It is the most commonly used screener for insomnia or sleep disturbances, and it's very easy to use. This is something you could consider having in your practice. I do want to note that something like this would not detect sleep apnea. It's more for insomnia. And for referral purposes, treatments that you can be familiar with are shown here with respect to insomnia. What we know works, and the first strategy recommended, is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. This is a brief therapy approach, often 8 to 10 sessions. It includes 4 different components. It has homework, and it can be very effective. Another form of treatment for insomnia, if you needed to know this for referral purposes, are obviously some of the medications, and these include non-benzodiazepine hypnotics and trazodone. This next screen here, called the Patient Health Questionnaire, is for depression. And actually, the first 2 items there, A and B, comprise what's called the PHQ-2. That can be given, and if someone scores a 3 or higher, you can then give them the full screen. So it's kind of like a pre-screen. So the rest of the questions equal the PHQ-9. And it's very easy to score. A score of 15 to 19 is going to be moderate. 20 and above is going to be more indicative of severe depression symptoms.
After this webinar.
For referral purposes, again, it's important to be familiar with treatments for depression, and you probably already know some of these, but just to review them, the evidence-based therapies for depression that have shown good results are cognitive behavioral therapy, problem-solving therapy, and interpersonal therapy. And from my experience, the most common one used there is the CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's a short-term approach, also has homework, very structured, and it would be something to consider in a referral. And as you know, also there's going to be medications that can be used to treat depression. What you see here are some of the first-line agents, things like the SSRIs, the SNRIs, bupropion, and mirtazapine. In some cases, a client may need to use both of these. I want to make it clear that depression self-report screens aren't going to be good enough to effectively assess if a parent of a service member is a threat to him or herself. We need to complete a safety evaluation. It's really important to ask verbally, to not only ask on a screener or a piece of paper whether the parent, whether the patient is having suicidal thinking. Because surprisingly, what we find is that patients may be more honest in their response to you when you verbally ask them if they're having thoughts of harming themselves, and they wouldn't put that on a piece of paper. And I want to also make it clear that people don't become suicidal merely because we ask them this question. Sometimes there is the misperception, the myth, that if you ask about it, if you mention anything about suicidal thinking, that's going to make someone who's kind of depressed suicidal. And we know that that's not the case. It's actually the opposite. It's extremely important to just be forthright and ask the question. Parents of service members may talk around their suicidal thoughts. That is, they may use more indirect comments like you see here, saying something like, I just want to end it. I sometimes think about taking pills. I don't want to live anymore. But again, we really stress that you be direct and ask a question like, are you having or have you recently had any thoughts of harming yourself? If the parent endorses yes to this, then you're going to want to inquire about the intent to act on those thoughts and the plan, if they have a plan in mind. This next screen here is for post-traumatic stress disorder, and I want to clarify that with the recent DSM-5, the criteria for PTSD have changed. So at this juncture, any of the screens or self-reports that we had been using prior to the DSM-5 coming out are not going to be applicable because they're not based on the newest criteria. So the screen I'm sharing with you here is one that's come out by the APA kind of as an interim sort of self-report screen that is capturing the newest criteria for PTSD that you would find in the DSM-5. Later in time, I think many other screens for PTSD will be validated for use based on the DSM-5, but for now, this is one that you could consider using. The other point I want to make about this screen, again, you see here it has 9 questions that are capturing the different PTSD criteria, is that while we may think that it's the service member only who has PTSD because of the combat experience or maybe sexual trauma, actually there can be parents who have a sub-threshold PTSD, or what we might call a latent PTSD, and it's triggered because of their service member's deployment and the stress that that parent is feeling related to it. So the trauma that the parent has that is related to their PTSD goes back to something else, maybe childhood abuse or something. And maybe those symptoms were being masked or managed or hidden in a way they were functioning. But this huge stressor of having a child deployed or something bad happening to their military child can then trigger or set off the PTSD symptoms, so they indeed have the disorder or maybe a sub-threshold level of it which needs to be treated. And I want to just go over the treatments for PTSD that are currently being used that have been found to be evidence-based and effective, and they are the ones you see here. The trauma-focused psychotherapies, exposure-based one, cognitive-based ones, eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing, and combinations of the above. All of those are cognitive behavioral approaches to treating the trauma, which involve in some shape or form having the individual, in this case if it were a parent, having the parent visit and talk about the trauma, or at least the thoughts around what occurred. You also can use medication, as you know, and this is not a comprehensive list here, but SSRIs, things like Paxil and sertraline, and the SNRIs have been found to be effective. I like this photo because hopefully it does show someone having a nightmare. And what I want to emphasize here is that you could have a parent of a service member who you see who talks about sleep problems. And if you probe further, you realize that really at the root of the sleep problem are recurrent distressing nightmares. And the good thing about finding that out is that these days we have good treatments for nightmares. So this isn't about treating PTSD. It's focusing on the nightmares only. But what you see on the slide here are two effective treatments, and that first one, imagery rehearsal therapy, is gaining a lot of evidence to support its use. It's a very brief therapy, often 3, 4, 5 sessions, and it's an interesting one because what you do is you have the patient describe their distressing nightmare. They tell that, they write that out, and they re-script it in a different way. And then when they're awake and they go home, they rehearse the re-scripted nightmare. And what we find is that the individuals gradually don't have the distressing nightmare anymore. We think that elements of exposure are at play here, and also a sense of self-mastery, that the individual finally is feeling like they can take some control over the nightmares. So IRT is out there, and there's practitioners who know it, and it can be highly effective. And then in addition is the medication, which you probably are familiar with, prazosin, which is actually used to lower blood pressure, but it has also been found to help reduce the intensity and frequency of nightmares. So it can be useful. The limitation of prazosin is that once the individual goes off it, it's very likely that the nightmares would resurface, whereas that would not be the case with the IRT. This last slide here is just talking about different forms of anxiety. The first one, generalized anxiety, is something a parent may present with, a more chronic worry that has symptoms of restlessness and irritability, muscle tension, sleeping problems, whereas panic attacks are actually episodes of a sudden feeling of fear without an apparent reason or cause. And the panic attacks are accompanied by really strong acute physical symptoms of anxiety. I only have a screen here for the generalized anxiety disorder. I don't have one for the panic. But this one, the GAD-7, can be used. And similar to the PHQ-9, if you use the first two items, it becomes the GAD-2. And if someone scores a 3 or above, it could be suggestive of an anxiety disorder, and then you could give the full screen. The full screen, and again, if that pops positive, you would want to have a further evaluation to see if they're meeting criteria for generalized anxiety disorder or another disorder. So having gone through those screens very quickly, those are things that you can access on your own, and they'll be up on the website. What I want to stress is that if you use any of these behavioral health screens and it's positive, that is, the scores are in that range suggestive of a disorder, again, it doesn't equal the disorder. What's warranted is that the client, the parent, be referred for a more thorough workup, that they get a more comprehensive psychological evaluation to see if indeed they meet full criteria for that condition. And then these screens can be used to help you discern if someone should be referred also for therapy or counseling, and recommending that when they get that therapy, they're receiving evidence-based treatment, like we talked about, that they should use the most effective treatments out there. Medication may be provided after you do these screens and after a more comprehensive workup is done. And finally, I want to emphasize that behavioral health conditions, all the ones I just talked about, are treatable, and we know that whether it's the parent of a service member or the service member himself, getting help sooner is better. And so those 2 points are important for you to stress with a parent of a service member who has a behavioral health condition like one I described. I know we don't have too much more time, but I'm going to quickly go through, this is the final part of the presentation, specific resources geared for parents of service members. I've broken them down into these 3 categories, and it may be helpful if you are with a parent of a service member that you too could describe them in these kind of 3 ways: educational resources, resources that really are going to help them build connections, and then finally resources that are going to give them access to counseling and support services. Unfortunately, there's not a lot geared specifically toward parents of service members, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, and that's one of the main reasons why we wrote our book. There are a few parent guides written. That is, these books are being written by mothers or fathers who have military children, and they give their experience, they make recommendations. That's what these 2 are here on the screen, and I've read them. They're very good, practical, relatable. There are, to my knowledge, other than the book that we've recently published, which you see here, Courage After Fire for Parents of Service Members, I don't know of any other books just for this population that have been written by mental health professionals. And that's why we wanted to have this book so parents could have something tailored just for them that meets their needs. There are a variety of websites that can be helpful. You see them here on the screen. Some have a limited amount of information for parents of service members. Actually, those first 3 do. If you go on, if a parent would go on, they would see some information specifically talking about their needs and having resources. The VA National Center for PTSD and After Deployment are more general websites. All of these websites have good general information about the military and how to deal with a service member and coping strategies and things like that. On this slide, I just want to highlight the Yellow Ribbon Reintegration Program. It's an important program actually geared for the Guard and Reserve and their family members, which includes parents. What the Yellow Ribbon Program does is they host these events. They're often after a deployment, and they bring together a lot of the local players, like local employers, local educators, etc., and the parents and the Guard and Reservists are invited to go there and get information and to network. They often cover topics like stress management and entering the job market. We spoke earlier about some apps that could be helpful to parents of service members. None of these is tailored just for the parent. Lots of people can use them, including the service member. We spoke about the first 2. Breathe to Relax is going to be teaching the individual diaphragmatic breathing exercises. The T2 Mood Tracker is going to help them track their emotional health, as I described earlier. The PTSD Coach is another good app. It offers psychoeducation about PTSD and treatment. It provides coping skills like relaxation training, and it gives assistance for immediate support, etc. So all 3 of those can be helpful, and they also can be helpful to the service member. This slide lists some outlets for parents to consider in building connections with other mothers and fathers. Some parent groups do exist, not a lot. That first one there, Blue Star Mothers, is a good one. I've heard very positive things about it. They tend to do activities and get support around doing activities together, like building care packages, and they tend to operate like on a local level. Fathers of the Brave is an online community support group with focus on fathers of service personnel, where they share information, share referrals. And family readiness groups is something for parents to consider, but in order to have access to the family readiness groups, the parents would have to be included because their military child tells the command and passes along their information. Otherwise, these groups would be geared more towards the spouse and the child. There are some social media forums that can be good for parents of service members, and the best one I've seen, because I know the mother who started this, is a Parents of Deployed Service Members Facebook group, and a lot of traffic and good dialogue is going on this one. I had access to it. It can be extremely helpful, and it's parent-specific, both mothers and fathers. Volunteering can be another great outlet for these parents to build connections. It can be through the military, or it can be other organizations, maybe through the Red Cross or through a school. And then, as we've mentioned before, faith-based groups, places of worship, can be good outlets for them to build those connections that are extremely important. In terms of counseling and support services, there are a few pro bono, not-for-profit counseling service organizations that have sprouted up with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. These include the ones you see here. Given Hour provides services to anyone who is or has been affected indirectly through a relationship with someone who's served in Iraq or Afghanistan. So that includes these parents, and they have volunteer therapists throughout the country, so that's a good resource. So Far is exclusively for Reserve and Guard and their extended family, to include parents. It's a good organization, but they only have chapters in certain states, so you would need to check on that. The chapters that I know they're in are in Massachusetts, Michigan, New York, and Florida. And then the Soldiers Project also offers counseling services to parents and to veterans and other loved ones, but they only have chapters in certain cities like Chicago and Sacramento, and also some in New York. I do want to point out at the bottom here that the Military One Source, which is often referred to as a great resource, the counseling it provides is only for the military member and their dependents, not the parents. I called recently twice to double check that. So although it's a great outfit, parents won't be able to be referred there for actual counseling services. And finally, you see on this slide, vet centers can offer bereavement counseling to parents of service members. They may be able to offer some other supportive counseling. They're less rigid than the VA hospitals. The VA Caregiver Support Program, this is new, it's good. It's for family caregivers of seriously injured post-9/11 veterans, whether they have a severe physical or emotional injury. And the caregiver receives a stipend, counseling, respite care, and other services, so that's something positive to consider. And then finally, I just want to note the Veteran Crisis Line and the Defense Centers of Excellence Outreach Center line that you see here, where both veterans and family members can call and have access to their information and support. I'll go ahead and stop with that.
Great, thank you so much. We will now open it up to questions and comments. If you do have a question, feel free to type it in to the Q&A box. In the meantime, we have had a question come up. Could you tell us where providers might find some of these assessments and screening tools that you've referred to earlier in the presentation, Dr. Domenici?
Yeah, most, if not all of them, are accessible just online. If they input the name that I gave, they'll pop up, and most are public domain. The only one I'm uncertain about and I could find out is the Insomnia Severity Index. So yeah, so they can go online and they will be able to see them and also get the scoring procedures.
Thank you. Also, we really appreciate the resources you offered on joining or creating a support group. Can you talk a little bit more about how someone might want to pursue that if some of those organizations are not in their area? What else can we do?
Let's see. Well, the one that is the Facebook page group, again, I know the mother who spearheaded that initiative and have been on it to see some of the traffic. I think it's really going well. For that one, if anybody was interested, I could give the name of Marcella. She's told me that I could give it, and she would be able to get them on the group so they would have access. For other ones, in terms of the readiness groups, again, the military child would need to kind of try to look out for that. There are comparable family readiness groups for the other services. The one I mentioned is Army-based. So the military child would need to ask and kind of get more information as to how to get the family member, specifically the parent, on board so they're being on the listserv and would get information. I would start also by having the individuals just perusing the ones that I've listed. And even a place like the National Military Family Association, the NMFA, which was the website I gave earlier, they could go on there and they might get some referrals.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for our presenter today? Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Dominici, for joining us today and sharing your expertise on this topic. Thank you to all of our participants for joining us today. We encourage you to complete the survey that follows this webinar to provide feedback. And a final thank you to everyone involved this week. Our webinar series has been a huge success, and we thank everyone for contributing their time to it. That's the final message for our webinar week. Thank you.